At 9:14 a.m., in a conference room designed to amplify confidence and mute doubt, he said it, clean, clipped, and just loud enough for everyone to hear, old, useless. No hesitation, no correction, just a verdict dressed as an observation. She didn't react the way they expected. No tension in her shoulders, no sharp inhale, no attempt to reclaim space. She simply closed her notebook. Because what no one in that room realized, what didn't appear in dashboards, forecasts, or polished executive summaries, was that she wasn't just part of the system, she was the system behind the system. And the moment she stood up, something invisible shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, precisely, the kind of shift that doesn't register immediately, but by Monday morning, it becomes impossible to ignore. At 9:14 a.m., the room looked exactly the way it was designed to look. Glass walls, neutral tones, a long polished table that reflected just enough light to make everything feel sharper than it needed to be. Even the silence had structure here, measured, intentional. He stood at the head of the table, fingers resting lightly on a stack of reports he hadn't fully read. The CEO confident in the way people become when numbers usually agree with them. Old, useless. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sentence landed clean, precise, efficient, final. A comment that would be framed later as just a moment, taken out of context, or misinterpreted. But not now. Now it hung in the air like something heavier than sound. Across the table, a few people shifted in their chairs, not dramatically, just enough to signal awareness without involvement. Someone adjusted their pen, someone else glanced at a laptop screen that suddenly became very important. And she didn't move. Not immediately, because reactions in rooms like this are currency, and she had spent years learning when not to pay. Her notebook was open in front of her, clean handwriting, structured thoughts, timelines that never made it into official presentations, not because they weren't important, but because when everything works, no one asks why. She had built that quiet reliability, not with speeches, not with visibility, with absence of problems, the kind of work that doesn't get applause because it removes the need for it. He continued speaking, already moving past the moment as if it had served its purpose. We need faster thinking, more adaptability, people who can actually keep up with the pace of where this company is going. A few nods appeared, subtle, calculated. Agreement is easier when it costs nothing. She looked down at her notebook. For a second, just a second, it seemed like she might say something. Clarify, correct, remind. After all, she knew things no one else in that room tracked. Not fully, not completely. Dependencies buried 3 layers deep in vendor agreements. Legacy integrations no one had dared to touch. Workarounds that looked like inefficiencies but were actually stabilizers, invisible architecture. But she didn't speak. Instead, she drew a single small line across the bottom of the page, not aggressive, not symbolic, just final. Then she closed the notebook. The sound was quiet, almost too quiet to notice, but a few people did notice because it didn't feel like the end of a note. It felt like the end of something else. She stood up without rushing. No sharp movements, no emotional punctuation, just a simple shift from sitting to standing, control in its most understated form. I'll step out, she said, not defensive, not offended, neutral, the kind of neutral that doesn't invite discussion. The CEO didn't stop her. He barely looked up. Fine, he said, already turning a page in the report. We'll continue. And just like that, she was no longer part of the conversation, which to everyone else in the room felt like a small adjustment. A minor shift in dynamics, a replaceable absence. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Inside the room, the meeting resumed. Metrics, targets, forward looking statements. Outside the room, she didn't pause. She walked past the glass walls, past the open workspace where conversations overlapped and keyboards filled the air with a low mechanical rhythm. No one stopped her. A few people noticed, but noticing isn't the same as understanding. She reached her desk, same as always, minimal, organized, nothing excessive. She sat down, opened her laptop, and for a moment, did nothing. No dramatic emails, no visible reaction, just stillness. Then, precisely, deliberately, she began to adjust. Not loudly, not in a way that would trigger alerts or immediate questions, just small recalibrations, the kind that don't show up instantly, but compound. She stopped preempting issues that hadn't yet surfaced, stopped correcting assumptions before they became decisions, stopped filling the silent gaps no one admitted existed. Not sabotage, absence, a controlled withdrawal from the invisible layer she had maintained for years. On the surface, everything continued. Meetings ran, reports updated, numbers moved, nothing broke, not yet. At 10:02 a.m., someone in procurement noticed a delay, minor logged ignored. At 11:17 a.m., a system flag appeared in an internal dashboard, unusual but not urgent. At 1:43 p.m., a partner sent a follow-up email asking for confirmation on a clause that had always been quietly handled. It sat unanswered because the person who usually answered before the question was even asked was no longer doing that. By late afternoon, the structure still looked intact. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, something had already started to drift, subtly, invisibly, the kind of drift that doesn't trigger alarms until it's too late to correct course without consequences. And somewhere, buried inside a contract no one had reviewed end to end in years, a dependency waited, patient, unnoticed, and now unmanaged. By 4:06 p.m., the building still looked efficient. Elevators moved with quiet precision. Notifications chimed at controlled intervals. Conversations stayed within acceptable volume, low, professional, contained. On the surface, the system held, because systems like this are built to absorb delay, not to reveal it. At 4:12 p.m., the first real deviation appeared, not as a failure, but as a question. Subject line, quick confirmation, clause 12, timing alignment. It came from a partner no one in the room earlier had mentioned, not because they weren't important, but because their importance was assumed, embedded, taken for granted. The email landed in a shared inbox. It stayed there, unanswered, not flagged, not escalated, just waiting. Because the person who usually responded within minutes, often before the message fully registered as a task, was no longer intercepting the flow. At 4:37 p.m., a junior analyst opened the email. Read it once, then again. Something about the phrasing didn't feel standard. The wording suggested dependency, not just timing. He hovered over the forward button, then didn't press it, because escalation requires certainty, and certainty requires context. And context wasn't documented, not fully. At 5:03 p.m., a second email arrived. Following up, we're aligning internal release based on your confirmation. This time, someone did forward it to legal, to operations, to a manager who was already in another meeting discussing quarterly projections that still looked solid. By 5:28 p.m., the thread had 5 recipients. By 5:41 p.m., it had 9, each adding a short line, each asking a slightly different version of the same question. Can someone confirm? Is this already approved? Who owns this? Ownership, a simple word, until no one can clearly answer it. At 6:02 p.m., legal responded carefully, neutrally. We need to verify dependency mapping tied to clause 12 before confirming. It sounded precise, professional, and entirely too late in the day to unpack. Because Clause 12 wasn't just a line in a contract, it was a hinge, a small, almost invisible mechanism that connected timelines across teams, across deliverables, across expectations that had quietly synchronized over months. No one had touched it recently because it had always worked. At 6:19 p.m., operations flagged a scheduling conflict. At 6:27 p.m., finance noticed a projection inconsistency, still minor, still explainable, still containable. At 6:44 p.m., the partner sent a third message, shorter this time, less patient. We're finalizing on our side. Please confirm alignment. No emojis, no soft language, just pressure, applied politely. Inside the building, lights remained on longer than usual, not dramatically longer, just enough to suggest something wasn't closing cleanly. At 7:08 p.m., someone finally asked the question out loud, who usually handles this? Silence, not immediate but delayed, because answers surfaced slowly when they relied on memory instead of structure. A few glances exchanged, a few names almost mentioned, then stopped, because saying it would mean acknowledging something else. At 7:16 p.m., the realization formed, not fully, not collectively, but in fragments across different minds at the same time. She, but she had left the meeting and no one had pulled her back in. At 7:22 p.m., a manager checked her calendar, unavailable. At 7:25 p.m., someone drafted a message to her, didn't send it, because reaching out would mean explaining why, and explaining why would mean reconstructing something no one had fully mapped. At 7:38 p.m., the system still hadn't failed. It was stretching, connections holding but under tension, threads pulling in directions they weren't designed to handle simultaneously. At 7:52 p.m., legal added a note to the thread, without confirmation, partner action may proceed independently. That sentence changed the tone, subtly, decisively, because independence in this context didn't mean efficiency, it meant divergence. And divergence, when tied to a $22 million deal, doesn't stay small, it compounds. At 8:11 p.m., someone finally sent her a message, short, controlled. Quick question, do you have context on Clause 12 timing? No urgency markers, no escalation tags, just a question. It remained unread. At 8:26 p.m., the partner stopped asking, not because they received an answer, because they made a decision on their side, aligned with what they understood, not what had been silently maintained. Inside the building, screens still glowed, but the tone had shifted, less confident, less fluid, more reactive, because when invisible systems stop being maintained, the visible ones don't collapse immediately. They hesitate, they misalign, they start asking questions they were never designed to ask. And by the time those questions reach the right level, they're no longer questions, they're consequences. By 9:03 p.m., the email thread had gone quiet, not resolved, just paused, because everyone assumed morning would bring clarity. It usually did, except this time, morning was already moving in a different direction, one no one in that room had fully accounted for. And somewhere, between a closed notebook and an unanswered message, a $22 million dependency had just slipped out of alignment. Not loudly, not dramatically, precisely. If you've ever watched a system run perfectly and thought, It just works. Pause for a second. Because sometimes it just works really means someone is holding everything together where no one is looking. And the moment that person steps back, the system doesn't crash immediately, it waits. Then it reveals the truth piece by piece. So here's the question. Have you ever seen a situation where one quiet decision changed everything without anyone realizing it at first? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to see how this unfolds, what really happened by Monday morning, and why that $22 million gap couldn't be fixed, stay with the story. Because the next chapter doesn't explain it, it exposes it. By Monday, 8:07 a.m., the building felt slightly different, not visibly, not in a way you could point to and say there, but in the way conversations started half a second slower, in the way people checked their screens before speaking, as if confirming reality still matched expectation. Weekend silence hadn't fixed anything, it had only preserved it. At 8:12 a.m., the CFO opened the report, not the summary, the actual file, because the summary, prepared late Friday, still looked acceptable. Slight deviation, manageable variance, language designed to calm, but the underlying numbers, they don't negotiate, they just align, or they don't. He scrolled once, then again. The figure didn't jump out immediately. It revealed itself gradually through absence. Revenue line unchanged, projected inflow adjusted, counterparty confirmation missing. Then there it was, a gap, not theoretical, not delayed, unaccounted $22 million, not highlighted, not flagged, just present. He leaned back slightly, not in shock, but in recalculation because shock is inefficient and he wasn't inefficient. At 8:16 a.m., he opened the email thread. It took less than 30 seconds to understand the pattern. Friday afternoon, escalation attempts, no confirmation. Partner proceeded independently. The structure hadn't broken. It had diverged. At 8:19 a.m., he asked the only question that mattered. Why wasn't this aligned? No one answered immediately because answers require ownership, and ownership in this moment was diffuse. At 8:22 a.m., someone mentioned clause 12 carefully, like referencing something that might be important but not fully understood. Legal opened the contract, scrolled, stopped, because clause 12 wasn't complex. That was the problem. It was precise. It defined timing dependencies between deliverables and partner confirmation windows, small details, narrow conditions, the kind that look insignificant until they're the only thing that matters. At 8:27 a.m., operations confirmed internal readiness had been based on an assumption of synchronized confirmation, an assumption that had always been correct until Friday. At 8:31 a.m., finance recalculated exposure, not hypothetical anymore, real, locked. At 8:34 a.m., someone said it out loud. The contract is gone, not canceled, not breached. Gone. Because the partner had executed under their interpretation, perfectly valid within the clause's timing structure. No violation, no leverage, just misalignment. At 8:36 a.m., silence settled in, different from Friday, heavier, because this silence had data behind it. At 8:41 a.m., the CEO entered the room. Room, same table, same polished surface reflecting the same controlled light. He looked at the faces, not panicked, not confused, just constrained. What's the status? He asked. The CFO didn't soften it. We have a $22 million gap. The partner moved forward without our confirmation. Clause 12 allowed it. No dramatics, no blame, just structure. The CEO's expression didn't change immediately because processing takes a second when the narrative you had on Friday no longer applies on Monday. At what point did this break? He asked. A fair question, a precise one, and dangerously difficult to answer, because nothing had broken. That would have been easier. Breaks are visible, traceable. This was absence. At 8:46 a.m., someone finally connected it, not as a statement, as a realization. She handled clause 12 alignment. The room didn't react outwardly, but internally, something clicked into place, not loudly, but definitively. Because now the timeline made sense. Friday morning, the meeting, the comment, her leaving, the unanswered thread, it wasn't cause and effect in a dramatic sense. It was removal. At 8:49 a.m., the CEO asked, "Where is she?" Calendar check. No meetings booked, no status updates, no visible escalation. At 8:52 a.m., someone sent a message, more direct this time. "We need your input on clause 12, urgent," delivered, unread. At 8:55 a.m., the CFO closed the report. Not because it was resolved, because it wasn't. And staring at it wouldn't change the number. "At this point," he said, "we're not correcting, we're accounting." A subtle distinction, but absolute. Correction implies control. Accounting acknowledges outcome. At 8:59 a.m., the CEO looked at the table. Same people, same roles, same system. But something fundamental had shifted, not in structure, in understanding. Because what had been invisible on Friday was now the only thing that mattered on Monday. And it wasn't documented, it wasn't assigned, it wasn't even fully understood. It had simply been there, maintained, quietly, until it wasn't. At 9:03 a.m., the room stayed silent. No immediate plan, no quick fix. Because this wasn't a problem you solve with urgency. It was a problem you should have understood before urgency was required. And now the system wasn't asking for answers, it was presenting consequences. At 9:11 a.m., urgency finally appeared, not as panic, as movement, phones unlocked, calendars opened, messages sent with sharper phrasing, fewer softeners. The kind of operational acceleration that signals something has crossed a line from manageable to exposed. At 9:14 a.m., her inbox received its third message. Subject: Need immediate clarification, clause 12 alignment. This one didn't pretend to be casual. No quick question, no neutral tone, just need immediate clarification. It remained unread. At 9:18 a.m., legal proposed a pathway. Reopen discussion with the partner. Frame it as miscommunication. Seek adjustment window. Technically sound, procedurally correct, and strategically fragile because adjustments require leverage. And leverage in this case had been quietly tied to timing, timing that had already passed. At 9:22 a.m., operations suggested an internal workaround. Shift deliverables, resequence dependencies, absorb the variance elsewhere. A familiar instinct: contain, redirect, stabilize. But the numbers didn't support elasticity at that scale, not cleanly, not without secondary impact. At 9:27 a.m., finance modeled scenarios. Best case, partial recovery over 2 quarters. Mid case, sustained gap with margin compression. Worst case, cascading adjustments across multiple forecasts. None of them returned the original state, because original state depended on alignment that no longer existed. At 9:31 a.m., the CEO stood up, not abruptly, deliberately. "We talked to the partner," he said, not as a suggestion, as direction. At 9:36 a.m., the call was scheduled. 9:50, 15 minutes to prepare an argument for something that, structurally, had already been decided. At 9:38 a.m., someone finally asked the question more directly. Why wasn't Clause 12 escalated earlier? Silence again. But this time, it wasn't confusion. It was recognition, because escalation requires awareness, and awareness had been delegated. Not formally, not visibly, but consistently. At 9:41 a.m., her name was spoken, not with accusation, with clarity. She always handled this before it reached escalation. The sentence didn't assign blame, it defined absence. At 9:44 a.m., the CEO looked at the door, same door she had walked through on Friday, same quiet click that no one had registered as significant until now. Get her on the call, he said, simple, direct, late. At 9:46 a.m., another message was sent, marked urgent, delivered, unread. At 9:50 a.m., the call connected. Partner on the line, calm, structured, already aligned with their own execution timeline, professional tone, measured pace, the kind of voice that signals preparation. Good morning, the partner said. We proceeded based on Clause 12 timing. All actions were within agreed parameters. No tension, no defensiveness, just position. At 9:52 a.m., legal responded. Understood. We're reviewing alignment on our side. There may have been a misinterpretation of timing dependencies. Careful wording, designed to reopen space, but space in contracts isn't created by tone, it's defined by text. At 9:55 a.m., the partner paused, just long enough to signal consideration. Then, from our perspective, the interpretation is consistent with the clause. We acted within the confirmation window as defined. Translation, without saying it, we didn't miss anything. At 9:57 a.m., the CEO stepped in. We're looking for a path to realign execution. There's mutual value in maintaining the original structure, strategic framing, value-based, forward-looking. At 9:59 a.m., the partner answered. We are open to future opportunities, but this execution is complete, polite, final. At 10:01 a.m., the call ended. No conflict, no escalation, no resolution, just confirmation of outcome. At 10:03 a.m., the room remained still, because now there was nothing left to negotiate, only to understand. At 10:06 a.m., the CEO didn't sit down. He stayed standing, looking at the table, not at individuals, but at the structure they represented. How did we build a system where this depends on one person? He asked, and no one sees it until it's gone? A precise question, not rhetorical, and difficult, because the answer isn't usually in one decision, it's in accumulation. Years of quiet efficiency, unrecorded fixes, unassigned ownership that still gets handled until it doesn't. At 10:11 a.m., no one responded immediately, not because they didn't have opinions, because opinions wouldn't change the pattern. At 10:14 a.m., the CFO spoke. We didn't assign the dependency, he said, we relied on it. A distinction, critical and expensive. At 10:17 a.m., the CEO finally sat down, not as a signal of closure, as acknowledgement, because this wasn't a moment to fix forward. It was a moment to recognize what had already happened and what it revealed. At 10:21 a.m., someone quietly asked, "Do we know why she didn't respond?" The question lingered, because answering it would require going back to Friday, to a sentence, to a moment, to something that, at the time, looked small. At 10:24 a.m., no one answered, not out loud, but the room understood, and somewhere outside that room, a closed notebook remained exactly where it had been left, unopened, unrevised, final. At 10:32 a.m., the room stopped trying to fix it. Not because they didn't want to, but because every path now led to the same endpoint: acknowledgement. The number wasn't moving. $22 million wasn't a projection anymore. It was position locked. At 10:36 a.m., the CEO exhaled, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to signal a shift from control to assessment. Document everything, he said, not for recovery, for record. Because once a system exposes a flaw at this level, it stops being an incident. It becomes a reference point. At 10:41 a.m., legal began reconstructing the timeline. Friday, 9:14 a.m., meeting. Friday afternoon, unconfirmed dependency. Friday evening, partner proceeds. Monday morning, gap confirmed. Clean, structured, almost clinical, except for one element that didn't fit into any column: why the dependency wasn't maintained. At 10:44 a.m., operations mapped internal flow. Everything had moved as expected, based on assumptions that had always held, assumptions that were never formally assigned because they never failed until they did. At 10:48 a.m., finance finalized exposure reporting. No rounding, no smoothing, just the number placed exactly where it belonged. A visible absence in a structure that had always appeared complete. At 10:52 a.m., the CEO looked at the report again. Same lines, same gap. But now it wasn't just financial, it was structural, because numbers reveal outcomes, but patterns reveal causes. And this pattern was consistent: invisible ownership, untracked dependencies, silent corrections that never entered the system. At 10:57 a.m., the question returned, this time quieter but sharper. Where is she? At 11:01 a.m., HR checked status. No sick leave filed, no out of office message, no formal notice, just absence. At 11:04 a.m., someone suggested calling, not messaging, calling, because urgency at some point stops being polite. At 11:06 a.m., the call went through, ringing once, twice, then voicemail, no message left. Because what do you say? We need you after saying something else? At 11:09 a.m., silence returned. Not the same silence as before. This one had weight, because now the absence wasn't just operational, it was personal. At 11:12 a.m., the CFO closed his laptop slowly. Recovery isn't the question anymore, he said. Continuity is. A different lens, forward facing, because once a system reveals it depends on something undocumented, the risk isn't the loss you see, it's the ones you haven't identified yet. At 11:16 a.m., the CEO nodded. Not agreement, recognition. We map everything, he said. No assumptions, no silent dependencies. Correct, necessary, late. At 11:20 a.m., the room began to move again, but differently, not reactive, analytical, cataloging processes that had never been written down, identifying decisions that had never been formally assigned, tracing lines that had always existed but only in practice. At 11:27 a.m., someone opened an old internal document, a framework draft, unfinished, because it had never been urgent until now. At 11:31 a.m., the realization settled, not as a shock but as a conclusion. They hadn't built a system that worked on its own. They had built a system that worked because she was in it, and they had mistaken that for stability. At 11:36 a.m., the CEO stood again, not to direct, to state. We don't lose $22 million because of a clause, he said. We lose it because we didn't understand what was holding the clause together. No one disagreed, because disagreement requires an alternative explanation. And there wasn't one. At 11:40 a.m., the room fell quiet one last time, not waiting, not expecting resolution, just processing. Because this wasn't a story about a mistake or a misread contract or a delayed email. It was about something far less visible and far more costly, a system that depended on something it never defined. And the moment that something stepped away, the system didn't collapse. It revealed itself completely. At 11:44 a.m., the report remained on the table, open, unchanged, a gap where alignment used to be, a number where certainty used to live, and around it, a room that finally understood what had actually happened. Not on Monday, not in the contract, but on Friday, at 9:14 a.m. when a sentence was said, and a system lost the one thing it didn't realize it couldn't operate without.